You found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there, YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. We are on the last episode talking about Dr. Brian Thomas and his take on human evolution. Now, when we last left off, he was basically just complaining about hominin reconstructions because they were too plausible, and he would prefer that they be based off of the lies that Answers in Genesis, and by extension, the Institute for Creation Research, tell. I don't think that's reasonable, but he seems to. So, anyway, let's see what else he's got for us.
But it is really persuasive.
Yep, science-based paleoart sure is persuasive, probably because reality tends to be a good guide to reality, and that's what this is based on, the real bones. Not the bones as creationists wish they were, as we can see in the Creation Museum in Kentucky.
And so we have generations of kids coming up watching, what are these, ape-man movies?
What, Walking with Cavemen?
Planet of the Apes and all this garbage?
Planet of the Apes. The movie franchise about artificially uplifted apes that has nothing to do with actual evolution and even less to do with human ancestry, but instead is more of an allegory about the plight of marginalized groups who are seen as subhuman, as well as the tendency for such groups to then become the abusers when they gain power, and also about the hubris of man when he plays God. Those movies? Yeah, I'm sure they're actually pro-evolution propaganda films by Big Darwin, even though evolution doesn't really factor into them at all.
And they're creepy looking, you know, and persuasive.
I don't know if they're creepy, but I'll tell you what, I'm fully convinced not to develop a cure for degenerative brain disorders in the form of a virus that will be lethal to most humans and turn the rest of them into idiots, but increase the brain power of other apes, while also somehow reshaping their vocal tracts and mouths. No sir, I will not do that, not even once. I have been persuaded.
And you know, maybe we did evolve, and the surveys that we're taking show that these youngsters are more influenced by Hollywood than by their own parents and by science or common sense.
Weird, because near as I can tell from how Thomas tells it, the survey didn't ask anything about the movies or why people were convinced by human evolution. Of course, he didn't bother to cite the survey, so I can't really tell exactly what was in there, but I would be very surprised if anyone was convinced of human evolution by a movie that has nothing to do with human ancestry, except perhaps in the most roundabout way.
So, we got a lot of work to do, class, a lot of work to do.
Step 1 should probably be to stop spreading very obvious lies about Australopithecus, lies that can be debunked by just looking at the fossils.
So this is just storytelling.
Says the guy who wants the stories of Genesis 1 through 11 to be taken as literal history, even though they're internally contradictory.
By the way, uniquely human attribute.
Oh, hold the phone. Are we actually about to get something that we can use to objectively tell if a fossil is a human according to the standards of the Institute for Creation Research? That would be pretty great. I've never heard them do that. Now, of course, let's hope that it's not something that is generally useless in terms of identifying fossil taxa as humans, like the tendency to worship or something. You know, something you can't find in a fossil.
Is our eyes.
Jesus Christ. So not only is it not something we can see in the fossil record, it's not even true. Play it again.
We have the whites of our eyes are visible in people.
Blah, blah, blah. Lies about ape anatomy, we're skipping. It's already been done to death.
So when a gorilla or a chimp or a dog or a baboon directs its attention at something, it turns its whole head in that direction. And so you could tell where it's looking.
You know, originally I was going to go into this whole thing about how obvious it is that dogs and primates can both turn their eyes to track things, and then use lots of clips illustrating this. But, I'm gonna do this instead. The evidence Thomas is lying is on his own slide. That's a picture of a gorilla turning its eyes to the right. Like, I get lying. I understand why someone would do that. But why would you lie while putting the thing you're lying about on your own screen, showing that you're lying?
But with us people, I can have my head over here, but my attention is directed, here.
Wow, just like the gorilla.
But you can tell where I'm looking because you could see what?
Yeah, the whites of the eyes, which is probably why white sclerae became ubiquitous in Homo sapiens, gaze following. But the reason that's even a possibility is because ape eyes, the eyes humans have, can move in their sockets. In fact, that's how mammals on the whole stabilize their gaze, by moving their eyes. The animals that can't do that are generally birds, which is why it seems like their heads are on gyroscopic stabilizers. They can't turn their eyes except by moving their heads, so their heads stay steady.
You can see the whites of my eyes. So we have a whole dimension of communication, interpersonal communication, that no animal has. And so, for example, we can go like this. Oh, this speaker is so boring.
Humans are indeed unique in their ability to communicate through eye motion, but guess what? All species are unique. If there were two identical species, they'd just be one species. Being unique among apes doesn't negate that humans are apes, nor does it do anything to argue against their common ancestry with other apes.
No animal does that. No animal can do that.
Well, at least one can, the ape known as Homo sapiens.
They don't have the eye muscles, they don't have the eye controls.
Yeah, no animal except basically every mammal. Hey, what's this dog doing? Oh, it's moving its eyes. What's this cow doing? Oh, it's moving its eyes. What's this chimpanzee doing? Oh, it's moving its eyes. Has this moron never even seen any mammals in his life? Honestly, how does he get away with this? He's just pissing on his audience and telling them it's rain, and they're just opening their mouths to swallow it. Maybe that's what they're into.
And they don't have the software in their brain to interpret what those motions mean.
Well, that sure is a claim. I wonder if we can get any evidence for it. I'll admit that I'd be persuaded if most mammals had sophisticated gaze-following abilities, but to claim that none of them do apart from humans, that's a pretty bold statement.
We do. We have all that. Uniquely human. That's part of what it means when he says human soul.
Finally, something that Brian says that's correct. I'm pretty sure that is indeed why John Gertsch, or Gertsch, still not sure, put those white sclerae in his Australopithecus afarensis model.
So anyway, shame on him.
Yeah, shame on a paleo artist for accurately reconstructing a fossil taxon with plausible speculative soft tissue. How dare he? He's supposed to lie about the fossils like a creationist. Anyway, we're moving on to Homo habilis.
So I'm holding the famous skull replica, KNMER 1470, and it's supposed to be one of the original Homo habilis skulls. It looks like a tiny person.
Anytime someone bases an allegedly scientific opinion on what something looks like, you're dealing with a pseudoscientist. Actual biological anthropologists don't have the luxury of just eyeballing skulls. They actually have to take measurements and compare them to species standards, holotypes, previous literature, etc. Lots of things look like things they're not. This island looks like a dolphin. This rock looks like an elephant. This man looks like a reasonable person. Looks like isn't ever evidence of anything besides that your brain made a connection.
So this got more popularized in 1959 with Mary Leakey, and she found, and she published it in Nature in 1964.
Did Brian really just tell us that something got popular after it was discovered, as if before it was discovered was an option?
Her ape skull fragments found mixed with human tools.
Well, yeah, they were stone tools. But how does Brian know that they're human? What does he even mean by human? Today, that's an easy question to answer because humans and chimps have significant morphological and behavioral differences. But in a world full of many hominin species, it's not so clear what human means. Heck, we haven't even heard a definition for the word ape. Thomas is just relying on the intuitions of his audience, but as you might know, intuition is not a very good guide to science. Intuition tells you that heavy things fall faster than light things, and that Earth is flat, that light travels at essentially infinite velocity, and that cold is a real thing. None of those things are true.
Human tools. Now, how did she interpret this? You got a pit, a bunch of bones, bone fragments. Some human tools in there, too. Only people make these kinds of tools.
Well, given that there were no other animals capable of using tools found at the site, and that even chimpanzees can make basic stone tools and have an archaeological record, there is no particular reason to conclude that an animal that is closer to humans than to chimpanzees couldn't have more sophisticated stone technology than them, but less sophisticated than any known modern humans. And that's what we have here. It's important to remember that despite what Thomas just said, these tools are Olduvai-style tools, a style of tool that fell out of use some 1.4 million years before the oldest archaic Homo sapiens came about. That's another reason these tools were associated with the apes at the site and not unknown apes that were allegedly human, whatever that means in this context. Olduvai tools are composed mostly of what are called choppers, essentially largish bits of flint that are knapped to produce sharp tools with a blunt handle that can fit in the palm of the hand. These tools can be used to cut and scrape things and are thought to be mostly used for food processing. Cutting meat into manageable chunks, scraping meat off bone and skin, and perhaps separating undesirable bits of prey from choicer bits. And of course, another reason to attribute the tools to the present apes is that the apes were not evidently butchered, because many of the other animals, including other primates, were at the site, and all had butcher marks on their bones from those same choppers, but not the apes in question.
So you got evidence of humans, and then there's ape. And she concluded what? The apes made these tools.
There was no evidence of modern humans, though, and I will be going with the idea that by human he means Homo sapiens until he says otherwise. Olduvai-style tools have never been found in association with any Homo sapiens finds ever, anywhere. The only reason Brian Thomas says that they're human is because otherwise they seem attributable to the Homo habilis individuals found at the site in Olduvai Gorge. Brian Thomas is question-begging. He's assuming that humans had to make the tools in order to argue that humans made the tools. That's not how this works. If you want to make the claim that Homo habilis didn't make the tools associated with them and instead Homo sapiens did, you first have to even establish that possibility by finding any Homo sapiens associated with Olduvai-style tools. Then after that, you'll need to find some reason why they're the only ones capable of creating such tools. Then and only then are they evidence of the presence of modern humans at the Olduvai Gorge, H. habilis site. Until then, the parsimonious explanation is indeed that the apes whose bones were actually there and were not butchered are also the tool makers. Another point is that according to Thomas's conception of the world, these humans would have had to arrive after the Tower of Babel, and so were part of city-building cultures. Why were they suddenly making stone tools more crude than any ever associated with human remains anywhere in the world? You can't simply say that it's a lack of resources, because these tools are made with exactly the same resources as much later and more sophisticated stone tools. The only reason to make choppers, but not to make spearheads, arrowheads, actual stone knives, etc., is basically that you don't know how. This makes sense given that Homo habilis is very unlikely to have the cognitive sophistication of later members of genus Homo, such as H. neanderthalensis or H. sapiens.
So it was a smart ape, and she called it Homo habilis. She fitted into that category.
Look, the genus Homo is an arbitrary designation, as are all generic designations. There are not objective criteria that define the bounds of a genera. Each biological subfield has its own conventions, and the diversity in genus of beetles will rival that of the whole family in mammals. Unfortunately, Homo is also ill-defined. Whether something ends up in Homo is a bit of a vibe check, although obviously brain case size, a relatively small amount of sexual dimorphism compared to earlier Australopiths, and being a bit later, in time, help. If Brian is just complaining that there's no objective way to separate Australopithecus and Homo that one can apply, for certain, to tell the two apart, then he's right. Of course, the problem is that the line is arbitrary. There is a smooth gradient for all morphological features throughout the hominin fossil record, and there is no obvious transition point between Australopithecus and Homo. The transition is too smooth for that. If I present you with a low color depth gradient from blue through purple to red, you can probably pick reasonable places to say that the color has gone from one to the other. But if I increase the color depth, suddenly it becomes hard to do. Early on in the study of human evolution, when we had far fewer fossils and far fewer species to deal with, it was pretty easy to say who was in genus Homo and who wasn't. But now that we have dozens of species and hundreds of thousands of individuals, we have so much data that we can't simply find easy clusters that we can tag with generic labels. But that's the thing. That's what evolution says should be the case. The idea of separate creation should predict that as we find more material, we don't see a smooth gradient from one form to the other. Instead, clustering should persist, increasing in its statistical significance, which is the opposite of what has happened. The very fact that there is the possibility for debate about who does or does not belong in genus Homo is itself evidence of evolution.
Now, is there another way to interpret the same data?
Of course, there always is, but the question is, do other alternatives have better support, and do they require things that are not in evidence?
Okay, raise your hand if you've got an interpretation of the same data. Yes, sir, in the middle. Have you ever been that hungry? You raised your hand first. It's like, they ate the ape. Apes are delicious. I love apes. Yeah. Hope you don't have to do that often, but certainly that's a way to interpret the data, and it's consistent with the biblical framework, apes being apes, people being people, and people getting hungry.
Yes, that is a possible interpretation, but you'll then have to explain why the apes were not butchered like the other prey animals at the site, and why no physical remains of Homo sapiens have been found associated with the tools at the site or even tools similar to those anywhere else. Until then, this explanation of humans butchering Homo habilis individuals and eating them isn't even a possibility, because the basics of humans even existing at a time and place hasn't been established, and the apes haven't been butchered. I look forward to all the upcoming paleoanthropology fieldwork from creationists finding Olduvai-style tools with modern human remains, as well as in layers consistent with the age of the Olduvai Gorge site, and of course evidence that humans have ever opted to not butcher prey apes, while butchering everything else.
Okay, this is it. If we don't have Homo habilis, then we lose the central link between apes and humans.
Well, I would argue that the central link between apes and humans is similar to the central link between lizards and reptiles. Humans are apes in every way, and are no less apes than chimps or gibbons. Further, the fossil record of hominins is not dependent on any one species. Lastly, we do have H. habilis. Question begging and making things up to refute the evidence about H. habilis might make Brian and his ilk feel better about their obviously unfounded beliefs about evolution, but it doesn't actually make that evidence go away.
Homo habilis used to be it. In the 70s, it was it.
Nothing about that has changed, except that there are even more fossil hominins that have been found. The fact that Homo habilis isn't the transitional form isn't because its transitional nature has been called into question, but that so many other transitional forms have been found that it's not really unique in being transitional anymore.
But it ignores... Okay, so Homo habilis came from those layers here. Olduvai Gorge, Tanzania, same place. Olduvai Gorge was a fully human, modern-looking human skeleton, the whole skeleton.
So earlier I had said that there were no anatomically modern humans associated with rocks of this age or this site, and that it was well over 1 million years older than the earliest Homo sapiens. So what's this? Well, this is OH1, a human skeleton from around the boundary between the Pleistocene and the Holocene. So why is it being talked about here? Well, it is indeed found in the same rock layers as the Homo habilis finds that we're also talking about. Well, the first clue that all is not as it seems is that the OH1 skeleton has been carbon dated, because it's only barely a fossil. The date came back with an age of about 16,000 years, far younger than the rocks it was found in. At first, this might seem like a problem for radiometric dating, as well as the consensus view of human evolution and the place of Homo habilis in that story. But let's take a page out of Dr. Thomas's book and see if there's another interpretation. But this time, rather than simply being satisfied by an interpretation that needs a whole bunch of unfounded assumptions to be true, we'll see if we can avoid any such assumptions and instead find evidence for our other interpretation. This skeleton is of an anatomically modern Homo sapiens. If you met this person while they were alive, they would just be some person from Tanzania. They'd probably have dark skin as a result of their tropical location. They'd probably have worn clothes made of animal hide to keep the sun off them, at least during the dry season. They would have used stone tools like hand axes, arrows, spears, pounding stones, etc. They probably would have sewn with plant fibers and bone needles. So how could such a person end up in a 1.5 million-year-old layer of rock? Well, there's a practice that is very common in Homo sapiens, so common in fact that creationists like to use this practice in Homo neanderthalensis to argue that they're actually not even a distinct species. This practice, of course, is burial. The practice of digging a hole to put the remains of a dead conspecific in, or in some cases, even other animals such as pets in. Of necessity, this places the body lower than it would have been if it were preserved in situ where it died, or even if it were transported some distance naturally by the water. Could we check for such a practice? Well, it turns out, yes, we can. Burying involves digging a hole, obviously, and this disturbs whatever sediments or other geology was in the volume of the hole before it was dug. In terms of geology, this is called reworking. You can detect it because of things like chaotic bedding planes, the inclusion of elements from higher in the strata with the lower material, etc. Essentially, you can tell if someone dug a hole in a place or not, and the youngest material in that hole gives you an idea of when the hole was dug. Well, now we have an interpretation of the OH1 skeleton that we can test for. And yes, of course it was tested for, and yes, the area has been reworked around OH1, meaning that it was indeed an intentional burial, and it is not associated with the Homo habilis site. Similarly, if I went to the ruins of ancient Jericho and buried someone there, that wouldn't mean that that person lived in ancient Jericho, and it would be unlikely that any later archaeologist would think that they did.
It was discovered in 1913, named OH1, Olduvai hominid 1, and it's been there, and no one's talked about it since. Even modern paleoanthropologists, some of them don't even know about it.
Well, that's just a lie. On doing a Google Scholar search for OH1 Olduvai, and restricting the dates to 1914 to the present, 102 papers come up. Indeed, I have in my sources 2 21st century papers and the 2004 paper, The Geoheritage of Olduvai Gorge, Tanzania, providing geological answers to the human origin question, published in the Lyell collection, and the 2017 paper, Taphonomy and Paleoichnology of Olduvai Hominid, OH1, Tanzania, by Matu et al. In the Wiley Online Library. I guess I can't guarantee that there are no paleoanthropologists that are unaware of OH1. I doubt it, but it's possible.
It's just sort of buried. That doesn't fit into our paradigm. Let's not even talk about it.
Talk about projection. It is in fact talked about, and nothing about a Pleistocene human being buried in some layers from a million years earlier in any way contradicts the paradigm of evolutionary biology or the consensus view of human evolution broadly. Or of the Homo habilis site at the Olduvai Gorge. All Brian Thomas, PhD, had to do to know that he's wrong, that it's not talked about, is one quick Google Scholar search. Something I managed to do. Why didn't he? It's not the evolutionary biologists and paleoanthropologists who are ignoring evidence. Thomas is so ignorant of the evidence that he doesn't even know what the field is and isn't actually writing about.
But there, it's fully human.
Yeah, that much later human skeleton that is not associated with the Homo habilis remains in any way and that was buried there long afterwards is indeed fully human. Too bad that's irrelevant to what's going on with the Homo habilis and their prey and their tools.
And here's an example of what I said I was going to show you. Not just monkeys down in the lower layers and moderns at the top. Now we've got a modern down in the bottom layer.
Shame about it being in a reworked area with younger sediment, meaning that it had to actually not be contemporaneous with the deposition of the rocks it's actually found in, isn't it? It kind of ruins the whole point Brian is trying to make.
And since the 70s, back in the 90s, and the double aughts and everything, we've found more of these hominids and...
We sure have, including animals that aren't even hominids. Animals like Kenyapithecus, Danuvius, Uranopithecus, Otivapithecus, Oreopithecus, Necalopithecus, Anoiopithecus, Dryopithecus, Hispanopithecus, Pierolopithecus, Rudopithecus, Samburupithecus, and Griffopithecus. But also plenty that are like Ardipithecus and Sahelanthropus.
Lucy types in layers above, in same layers as traditionally thought of as just being humans.
Hey, Dr. Thomas. If you ever watch this, I want to tell you this directly. I'm not talking to my regular viewers or new viewers who are here. I'm talking directly to you now. You know how the line, if humans evolved from apes, then why are there still apes, is a really bad argument against evolution because it fundamentally misunderstands how evolution works. And remember how, famously, one of the Morris dynasty actually wrote a whole article on your organization's website that's still there about how it's a really bad argument and no one should ever use it? Yeah, you remember that. Yeah, well, it doesn't suddenly become a good argument when you change it to the past tense and you swap out ape for Australopithecus. If the question is, if humans evolved from Australopithecus, then why are there Australopiths around when members of genus Homo had evolved? Then it's the same answer. Not all Australopiths evolved into members of genus Homo, and the persistence of multiple evolutionary branches is expected in evolutionary biology. Okay, now I also want you to understand that no other taxa that you could slot in there will ever make it a good objection to evolution. If seahorses evolved from fish, then why are there still fish? Is a bad argument. If birds evolved from dinosaurs, then why are there dinosaurs and birds in the same geological layers? Is the same bad argument. If whales evolved from even-toed ungulates, then how are there still cows? Is again the same bad argument. They're all the same argument. They all reveal the same basic high school level of misunderstanding of evolution, and all they do is make the people who make them look like they're ignorant. Or in the cases of PhDs, like you, it might make you look like a lying asshole. Okay, now I'll see what else you've got for me, and I'll go back to talking to my audience and not you directly.
Let's let the opposition tell us what they think about Homo habilis.
Oh. Okay.
Robinson considers that the original Homo habilis was a conflation, not a real thing. It's just a conflation of Australopithecus, that's Lucy bits, and Homo erectus, which is a human.
Yeah, almost 40 years ago, that was a contention that was made in the literature. Fun fact, that idea has been completely demolished by additional finds of Homo habilis that are so good we can even test to see if their joints fit together to see if they're composites or single organism. And they're single organisms. This conflation idea hasn't been plausible for decades. Do you think Dr. Thomas would take kindly to me digging up creationists from the past to accept species fixity? An idea he and most other creationists have long since abandoned to the point that they attempt to gaslight the rest of us into thinking that they never held it in the first place? Of course he wouldn't, but that's what he's doing here. There is no longer any dispute as to the validity of Homo habilis as a species, and really, there hasn't been since like the 1990s. However, there is still a dispute as to whether it's directly ancestral to other hominins such as Homo erectus and Homo sapiens. Whether it is or not, though, it remains transitional, because a species does not need to be on a direct ancestral line to be transitional.
So if you take ape parts, pretend like they belong with human parts, ta-da, you've got a missing link.
Which isn't what's going on here, and further, Homo erectus is certainly not a modern human. Once again, I don't know what he means by human, but apparently Homo erectus counts? So, why doesn't H. habilis count? In fact, in 2010 and again in 2023, creationist Todd Wood used the so-called science of baraminology to try to figure out where the boundaries of the humankind are, and found that not only is Homo habilis a valid taxon, but that it is in fact human, and that H. floresiensis, which Thomas has already called human, wasn't human, or part of any other ape kind. Apparently, it was a kind unto itself, which would have had to be on the ark. Heck, Todd would even put Australopithecus sediba in the human kind. If it's so clear that H. habilis is just an ape, then why is it also a composite and also a human? Why can't creationists agree on this? They clearly don't have any good way to actually say what it means to be a human in terms of anatomy.
And that's what they did.
No, it's not. Many of the Homo habilis finds were at least partially articulated, and their joint surfaces have been examined to determine that they were indeed single individuals. You see, as you use your joints, the two sides of the joints come to conform to the shape of the other side, meaning that you can actually measure this congruity between the articular surfaces of a joint to see if the two sides are from the same organism. So, what possible mechanism could allow for Australopithecus bones and H. erectus bones to come into articulation with congruent articular surfaces on the joints such that they strongly indicate that the bones are actually from the same individual? I would suggest that there's no possible way for this to happen, and that it is as definitive as evidence can be in science that the hominins found at the site in question, in Olduvai Gorge, are indeed members of a single valid taxon, H. habilis. There really are no other possibilities that are available to us.
And so Homo habilis is too variable to be a sound species. This guy doesn't even use it. Back in 87.
Great for him. I'm sure that back in 87 that was a reasonable take, but in terms of paleoanthropology, that's basically the Dark Ages. No workers in the field that I can find still take that position, and neither do many creationists such as the aforementioned Todd Wood, and his collaborator Peter, who goes by Paleologos here on YouTube and who is a friend of the channel. Yes, I do have creationists I'm friendly with. Peter, if you're watching, I hope you're doing well.
So I have Frankenstein there. Why?
Well, first, that's Adam, Frankenstein's creation, who was named after the biblical Adam, but he's there because he's a chimerical combination of body parts, and the contention that Thomas is making is that so too was Homo habilis, even though we know that that's impossible. And by we, I'm including a large segment of the young Earth creationist movement.
So the idea is, with Frankenstein, for you young folks who aren't fans of Mary Shelley yet, you stitch this body part together, and you get an arm from this guy and a head from that guy, and you get a brain from Igor, and you sew it all together and zap it with electricity, and suddenly it's alive.
Igor was Dr. Frankenstein's lab assistant, not an organ donor. But anyway, think about this. If Adam were real and you came across his skeleton, it would be obvious that it was asymmetrical and chimerical. There'd be no question about it. And that's a skeleton that's a chimera of different members of the same species. Never mind two different species. But that's the contention that Thomas is making for Homo habilis. That it's actually a collection of chimera of multiple individuals, each themselves composed of a consistent mix of H. erectus and Australopithecus bones. And that somehow that assemblage even occurred in the first place, even though he hasn't proposed a way that it could even happen in the first place, given the partial articulation of the skeletons, and that none of the still publishing paleoanthropologists have noticed. And that they've even published papers directly countering this idea. Does Brian think that there was an actual Dr. Frankenstein trying to create Australopith hybrids and he was sewing skeletons of Australopiths and H. erectus together? Of course, there is a further problem. It's not that H. habilis is transitional because it has an Australopithecus skull but a Homo femur. All of its bones are on their own a melange of derived Homo characteristics and more basal Australopithecus characteristics. So even if Thomas were right that these skeletons were to some degree chimerical, at least one of the organisms that went into the composites was transitional anyway.
And so I get the same sense with Homo habilis. It's like you get an ape part here and a human part there, and you put it together, pretend they belong together, and you write stories about it, and suddenly it's alive.
I'll take things that never happened for 500, Alex.
But it's only alive in our minds.
Well, given that it's extinct, it doesn't have a whole lot of other places it can be alive besides in the minds of modern humans.
The data are just ape bits and human bits. Well, that's separately created kinds. all along.
Non sequitur. Your facts are uncoordinated.
Even if that were true about Homo habilis being chimerical, it wouldn't actually provide positive evidence of separate ancestry. Let's do a thought experiment. Suppose I mix up European and African wildcat bones, and then started building skeletons out of that mix that were composed of the bones from each. Does that mean that the European wildcat, Felis sylvestris, and the African wildcat, Felis libica, don't share a common ancestor? No, of course not. But neither does it mean that they do. Their common ancestry is a separate question that has nothing to do with whether or not anyone has mixed their bones together into chimerical skeletons.
You don't have to take my word for it. I've got bias. Let's take the word for the people who are biased against the Bible.
I'm unaware of Ian Tattersall or Jeffrey Schwartz's take on the Bible, but I have no idea if they're biased against the Bible, and I suspect neither does Thomas. Scientists aren't anti-biblical simply because their conclusions are at odds with the interpretations of the Christian fringe. That's not how it works. In fact, for all I know, they're both practicing Christians. I don't actually know that, but just the fact that they're paleoanthropologists doesn't preclude that possibility.
Well, they say this: Homo habilis is an all-embracing wastebasket species into which a bunch of junk can be swept.
Okay, so now we have to go over what a wastebasket taxon is, of which a wastebasket species is a subtype. First, what it isn't is a place where you stick whatever you want regardless of whether it's even a valid organism, or whether you don't know what it is. These taxa are polyphyletic or paraphyletic by definition. A historical example would be Protista, which included basically all single-celled eukaryotes, but none of the multicelled eukaryotes. But this meant that some protists were more closely related to animals or plants than to some other protists. This means not that the animals referred to Homo habilis aren't real, or that they're chimerical. It means that they don't form a natural evolutionary group, and some of them are more closely related to members of other species than they are to other organisms referred to Homo habilis. But the problem is that the evidence of the transition from basal Miocene apes to humans isn't based on the rigor of the taxonomic designations of the animals involved, but on the actual existence of the animals with the morphology we see in the fossils, regardless of what they're called. Once again,
Non sequitur. Your facts are uncoordinated.
Here's another quote. The transition from Lucy to human is thought of as momentous, but the fossil record bearing on this is virtually undocumented. There's no fossils.
I've said it before, and I'm sure I'll have to say it again. Reading from the first sentence of the abstract of a paper is almost always a dishonest tactic, because that's where the author or authors set up the problem for which they are going to provide an answer or solve in the body of the paper. So let's read the whole abstract. Quote, although the transition from Australopithecus to Homo is usually thought of as a momentous transformation, the fossil record bearing on the origin and earliest evolution of Homo is virtually undocumented. As a result, the poles of the transition are frequently attached to taxa, e.g. A. afarensis, at circa 3 million years ago, versus H. habilis or H. erectus at circa 2.0 to 1.7 million years ago, in which substantial adaptive differences have accumulated over significant spans of independent evolution. Such comparisons, in which temporally remote and adaptively divergent species are used to identify a transition, lend credence to the idea that genera should be conceived at once as monophyletic clades and adaptively unified grades. However, when the problem is recast in terms of lineages rather than taxa per se, the adaptive criterion becomes a problem of subjectively privileging key characteristics from what is typically a stepwise pattern of acquisition of novel characters, beginning in the basal representatives of the clade. This is the pattern inferred for species usually included in early Homo, including H. erectus, which has often been cast in the role as earliest human-like hominin. A fresh look at brain size, hand morphology, and the earliest technology suggests that a number of key Homo attributes may already be present in generalized species of Australopithecus, and that adaptive distinctions in Homo are simply amplifications or extinctions of ancient hominin trends. End quote. This paper is not arguing that we don't have fossil evidence for the transition, but rather that the evidence we do have is best organized in a different way, and that rather than seeing the transition as some kind of momentous adaptive leap on the part of genus Homo, it is actually simply a continuation of the directional selection that was already occurring in Australopithecus. Let's read the conclusion of the paper. Quote, the fossil record bearing on the ancestry of Pleistocene Homo is poor. However, the more we learn about early Homo, the less compelling is the case that an adaptive shift can be read from the currently documented skull and skeletal anatomy as a major transition from generalized Australopithecus precursors. Early phylogenetically basal species of the Homo clade resemble generalized Australopiths more than they do later species of the clade, as expected from a Darwinian pattern of descent with modification. These and subsequent transitional species of the Homo lineage, e.g. H. erectus, erode the impression of distinct adaptive suites created by the comparisons between terminal taxa or those separated by large temporal gaps. The epigraph heading this paper indicates that Darwin himself recognized this as a probable outcome of the descent with modification, given a grown fossil record. The argument has recently been updated by Cartmill. This recognition is not, however, a paean to wholesale phyletic or gradual evolution in Homo, as was commonly asserted half a century ago. The African fossil record of Homo demonstrates diversity quite clearly between 2.0 and 1.7 megaannum, and there are hints of it as far back as 2.4 megaannum. It is rather an argument against adaptive unity as a biological necessity adjunct to monophyly in the definition of the genus category. Whether or not we choose to adopt the larger number of super-specific taxonomic ranks and their associated taxon names, dictated by a bushy hominin clade, is not a pressing scientific matter in the quest to understand human origins. Of greater importance can be counted recent arguments for the use or manufacture of stone tools in time periods predated by some 500,000 years, the earliest Homo fossils known so far, and the potential they have to shrink the adaptive space between Homo and Australopithecus still further. Indeed, the expanded brain size, human-like wrist and hand anatomy, dietary eclecticism, and potential tool-making capabilities of generalized Australopiths root the Homo lineage in ancient hominin adaptive trends, suggesting that the transition from Australopithecus to Homo may not have been much of a transition at all." End quote. Essentially, this paper is arguing almost the exact opposite of what Thomas is using it to mean. He's lying about this paper. There's no way he read this paper and came away with the idea that there are just no fossils documenting human evolution. Either he read the paper and is lying about what it says, or he's citing it without having read it, or he's too stupid to understand it. Those first two are themselves a lie, because citing something is a claim that you have read and understood the source, and the source means what you say it means. The other one seems unlikely, because he's smart enough to get a real PhD.
Documenting the transition from ape to human. Maybe it's because there was no such transition.
Then maybe Thomas shouldn't have cited a paper that said almost the exact opposite. Talk about a Trojan source.
I don't think there was. If there's no fossils to show it. Then, didn't happen.
Yeah, well, that's just like your opinion, man.
Second category, therefore, is human parts mixed with animal parts.
A thing that isn't happening. Okay.
Animal plus human. Guess what that is?
Well, given that humans are animals, it sounds like it's just a human. The same way saying human plus mammal just sounds like you're taking extra steps to say human.
Not a missing link. It's not good science.
Imagine being the guy who just blatantly lied about a paper saying that the consensus of an entire field he's given no reason for us to think he's even remotely familiar with is not good science. Creationists might be some of the most conceited individuals, short of flirts, that are out there on the internet right now.
It's not a reason to go back to my Bible with a pair of scissors and cut out the atom bits.
Well, I agree there, because there's this thing that's open to Thomas, like all Christians, called interpreting the Bible and one's theology in light of what we know to be true about reality. Sure, he doesn't have to, but he could.
And undermine the rationale for the gospel.
Hyperbolic much there? Look, I'm not here to tell Christians what to believe about the Bible or soteriology or whatever. But the very fact that most Christians accept evolution means that they have found a way to justify the gospel without young earth creationism. It's clearly possible.
It's just storytelling about animal parts, extinct apes perhaps, and pretended like they belong with humans.
Imagine being a self-identified biblical literalist who complains about storytelling.
Okay, last example, and we're getting down to our last category.
Hell, it's about time.
And it's Neanderthal. And here I took a picture from the Time Life book that I read in the 1970s that helped persuade me when I was a kid that I evolved from apes.
Oh hey, that's the original March of Progress illustration.
And there's Neanderthal, and he's just about to become a real person, but he's not quite there yet.
I'm not sure what the artist was going for in terms of personhood, but it does raise an interesting question. What does it mean to be a person? Well, one of the more intuitive answers is that a person is just another word for human. But on closer inspection, that seems not to be necessarily the case. Generally, intentionally causing the death of a human is considered murder, but disconnecting the life support of a brain-dead human is generally not considered murder, at least not for the person's next of kin. That suggests that some humans may not be persons. Similarly, it is a common trope in fiction to see non-human persons. Aliens like Klingons or Twi'leks, as well as fantasy creatures like elves and dwarves, are presented as non-human persons in most franchises in which they appear. Similarly, the general penalty in the Bible for killing a person follows the principle of lex talionis, that is, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, and life for life. But if a man injures a woman who is pregnant and causes a miscarriage, lex talionis does not apply. Instead, the woman's husband assesses a fine, subject to a panel of judges who are there to ensure that the fine is not exorbitant. But if he injures the woman and she dies, then lex talionis is invoked and the penalty is death. Clearly, both in modern times and biblical times, the categories of humans and person are not identical. I would argue that personhood has certain rights and obligations that attach, and that an organism that can and do demand those rights and can respect and does respect those obligations can reasonably be seen as persons. Those who cannot may or may not be persons, and while I do think it may be reasonable to recognize personhood in great apes and cetaceans, I'm not going to get into that now. But I do think that regardless of the fact that Neanderthals are not the same species as modern humans, they were probably persons. They seemed to have art, they had sophisticated tools, they had even bigger brains than H. sapiens, and while they probably communicated in a way that was not identical to human language, it was also probably not all that different. And so overall, while they're not the same species as living humans, calling them persons, I think, is reasonable. I think if there were a Neanderthal that had been transported through time to today, that killing that individual would be murder, and keeping that individual in captivity would be wrongful imprisonment.
Because, he's got a beetle brow and he drags a club.
Not in the picture Thomas is showing. For the second time now, he's just defeating his own point with his own slide. Once upon a time, I thought you had to be reasonably intelligent to get a PhD. Then I encountered creationists with PhDs, and I was forced to reconsider this idea.
And he's just kind of brutish.
Brutish implies violence, lack of communication, and uncontrollability. I have no idea what about that profile of a Neanderthal implies any of that. Now granted, you can indeed find such depictions, but paleo art isn't evidence, and it isn't science, so I'm not sure why that matters.
So when I was a kid, I was taught the Neanderthal was becoming human, not quite there yet. So that's the story.
Well, I won't speak to what little baby Brian was told as a kid, but that's not the current consensus. The current consensus is that Neanderthals are a sister species to Homo sapiens that evolved a bit earlier, but was also contemporaneous with Homo sapiens for a very long time, and that eventually went extinct. They are not as a species ancestral to H. sapiens, even though many modern members of H. sapiens have some Neanderthal DNA.
Since then, we've learned a lot about Neanderthal, hundreds of examples of their burials across Europe, mostly, but also some in China and in the Middle East.
The idea that these are intentional burial is common. I don't really intend to dispute it, but I do want to point out that the idea that that's what we're finding in Neanderthals finds is not completely uncontroversial. I don't have a dog in that fight, and I am perfectly happy for them to be burials.
Neanderthal genome, we take the bone, and we extract the DNA from the bone, and then scientists have been able to sequence the DNA and compare that sequence digitally with modern human DNA sequence.
And universally, the results are that Homo neanderthalensis genetics are outside the range of variation of both modern and ancient H. sapiens.
And it's a match. So they had human DNA.
A match to what? Certainly not Homo sapiens, because no study has come to that conclusion. In fact, the genetic studies were the final nail in the coffin of the argument that Neanderthal should be considered a subspecies of Homo sapiens, that is, Homo sapiens neanderthalensis. And since then, they have really only been treated as their own species, Homo neanderthalensis.
Which is exactly what we had been saying for decades here at the Institute for Creation Research, where we looked at just the anatomy.
You serious?
ICR needs Neanderthals to be descendants of Noah, but there's a problem with that. Well, really, there are a whole bunch, but who cares? First, we can calculate the time it would take to reach a common ancestor between Neanderthals and humans by looking at their mitochondrial and Y chromosome DNA. Really, we can do it for any part of the genome, but that's harder and the results are even worse for creationists, so we'll stick with the Y chromosome and mitochondria. Now, we know from genetic testing in places like the Canary Islands and Tristan da Cunha that the rate at which variations fix in these parts of the genome is considerably slower than just assuming the pedigree mutation rate from grandparent to parent to child would indicate. As a result, just extant human diversity would take hundreds of thousands of years to manifest in just the Y chromosome and mitochondria. But Nathaniel Jeanson, an Answers in Genesis affiliated pseudo-geneticist, has argued that if you simply ignore the fact that some mutations are not passed on, and that genetic drift is a thing, and that natural selection is a thing, then you can use the pedigree mutation rate as the substitution rate, and when you do that, you get a Y chromosome Adam some 4,000 years ago or so, and a mitochondrial Eve some 6,000 years ago or so, corresponding to Noah and Eve, respectively. Here's the problem, though. In order to do that, he had to exclude the Neanderthal DNA. Including it pushes his estimates back beyond the 10,000 or so year limit to the age of the Earth that young Earth creationism has. It completely destroys the young Earth creationist timeline, which was already something that required us to simply ignore reality to accept anyway. So it's physically impossible for Neanderthals to even be descendants of Adam and Eve who separately survived the flood. Never mind descendants of Noah. Neanderthal genetic data has completely precluded them from being actual human relatives, or it has completely precluded young Earth creationism. Of course, the problem is that they're so human-seeming in DNA and anatomy and culture that neither of these options seem available to ICR. So what do? Oh, they just lie about the results of the DNA and don't bother to actually run the numbers on the data to see how they can fit into the paradigm of young Earth creationism and flood geology.
Of these people. So they were people, we've been saying. They're people.
Yeah, but Neanderthal personhood and human common ancestry with apes as a group aren't the same question, and I'm perfectly happy to say that Neanderthals were persons. They were also apes, and they were also extremely closely related to modern humans. Look, if I went to Brian Thomas with archaeological evidence that the people in the Roman province of Judea were using cochineal bugs to make red dye for cloth in the 1st century, he'd probably be fine with that. If I were to then insist that that therefore disproves Christianity, he'd probably find that incredibly stupid. Well, that's how his proclamations of Neanderthal personhood sound to me when he uses them as a reason to reject evolution.
They do intentional burials. Like no animal buries its buddies.
Well, since I just granted that Neanderthals did, that means I can think of two that do, Homo sapiens and H. neanderthalensis. And it's not all that surprising that two such closely related organisms might have similar funerary behaviors. But also, having funerary behaviors is not unique to humans. Elephants, other apes, and even ants are all known to have behaviors associated with the remains of their conspecifics. In fact, Asian elephants have been observed burying dead calves when they find a suitable hole, which they have trouble digging themselves. But if they do find one, they'll do their best to put the dead calf into the hole and cover it with dirt. So actually, I would argue that there are 3 animals that are known to bury their dead: H. sapiens, H. neanderthalensis, and Elephas maximus. Of course, with the last, it's not as common due to physical constraints.
Only we do that.
Boy, was I wrong.
When they found that the DNA was 97+% match to modern humans, we thought, well, that's what we would have expected, and that's what they found.
It's not, though. That's just a lie. Creationists expect them to be within the range of human variability that could have arisen after the flood of Noah, but they weren't. I want to be clear about this. There is absolutely no way to square a post-flood existence of Neanderthalensis with a literal interpretation of the events of the flood. They completely debunk virtually all of ICR's ideas about the history of the Earth just by having existed. There is no way to square that circle, apart from just lying. And even then it causes problems, as Nathaniel Jeanson found out. That's why he just pretends that the genome data for Neanderthals are junk. Of course, the problem there is that we actually have high-quality genomic data, including quite high coverage for a fossil DNA sample, as well as the ability to reconstruct the genetic architecture. If the samples were low quality, we couldn't get such high percentage coverage and such detailed genome structure information. Yet we do. So the genomes are reliable, far too reliable to be hand-wave dismissed. No matter how strongly Thomas objects that Neanderthals were people, that doesn't make them any less a problem for young Earth creationism. If anything, I would say that they are single-handedly a bigger problem than all earlier members of the genera Homo and Australopithecus put together.
So here's a picture I took of a model of a Neanderthal man on display at the Field Museum in Chicago.
Neat!
Not an ancestor, just a totally human, totally fully human. They married with moderns. How do we know? Burial sites with Neanderthal people, modern-looking people, same burial.
I'm not aware of any confirmed joint burial sites of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, so this is going to be a citation needed. But also, a better reason to conclude that there was interbreeding is Neanderthal genetic integration into European and Eastern Homo sapiens populations. Of course, there are reasons other than some kind of formal marriage that could have happened. Not all mating is voluntary in the first place, and there's no evidence at all that marriage was even a thing at the time. Heck, it's not even really clear that the modern idea of marriage was even in operation at the time the Hebrew scriptures were being written.
They cooked their food, evidence of fire pits. They made jewelry, they made instruments, they buried their dead intentionally, their remains overlap humans, and they shared, 99%, 0.7, not 97, modern human DNA.
Which is entirely irrelevant to the question of human ancestry. No amount of advanced cognition in Neanderthals will make them Homo sapiens, and no amount of it will be a problem for human ancestry from non-human apes.
Okay, so that's our first example of our third category and final category, human.
A category he never actually bothered to define, so that's fun. I don't even know how Neanderthals are human by this definition, because he didn't give one. He did earlier imply that Homo erectus and H. floresiensis were human, although other creationists disagree with him, making the whole thing even more confusing. The only thing I can think of is that he's basically just determining humanity by vibe-checking fossil hominins.
Did you know that it's a dead human?
No, and I still don't know that, because I don't know what is meant by the word human in this context.
Did you know that people die?
Yes.
Are you ready to die? You gotta happen. It's gonna happen to you too.
I feel the gospel messaging coming on. My audience is familiar with Christianity, so let's skip that.
So because somebody died in the past, Neanderthal or otherwise, does that mean I have to go back to Genesis and chop out Adam?
I mean, if you want to maintain that the only possible interpretation of the primeval history of Genesis 1 through 11 is a literalist interpretation, then yes. But not because they died, but because they cannot be accounted for in the timescales available while maintaining that they're the descendants of Adam and Eve, much less that they're the descendants of Noah.
But there's no reason to doubt the Bible.
No, there's conclusive evidence it's wrong if taken the way ICR takes it. I'm not your priest. I don't particularly care what you think the proper interpretation of the text is. But I can tell you that if it's the interpretation that ICR has, then you're absolutely and verifiably wrong. Basic algebra and some real-world data are enough to completely put young Earth creationism far outside the realm of possibility. Unless God is just the biggest liar imaginable. Maybe that can be a new form of the ontological argument for God.
Everything we've seen, all these fossils, it's either a dead animal,
Yet again, they're all dead animals.
or it's a mixture, it's like a mistake,
Nope, not once. That's just a blatant lie.
or a conflation, is what they said, of animals and humans,
And when he said that, they didn't mean anything close to what he means.
or it's a dead human.
A claim we can't even assess because it's not at all clear what he means when he says humans in this context.
So guess what? That's biblical, biblical, and biblical.
You know, the fact that you have to misrepresent all the evidence and still not define terms in order to make the fossil record of primates compatible with your biblical interpretation isn't exactly a win. After this, he just keeps repeating himself and tosses a few other fossil taxa into the same fake categories that he's been talking about. Then it's a commercial for ICR products that are more or less related to the topic of the discussion. Well, I guess that's it. It was just a really lame summary of Contested Bones, a book that itself is mostly just lies. I expected nothing and I'm still disappointed. Oh well, if you enjoyed this video, please hit like and tell me what you liked in the comments. If you didn't, then hit dislike, and let me know what the problem was. Either way, please subscribe if you haven't and turn on all notifications so that occasionally YouTube might tell you about my content if they feel like it, regardless of your wishes. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Hey, before you leave, I just want to take a second to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above. Ben Tovind, Tapioca Weasel, Whispers, Ella Runteller, Horseflesh, Ian Chen, Kelvin Brostock Van Manen, Landon Knoll, Mabdy Babdy, Wallace, John Ackerman, and Strawberry Vein. It's because of my channel members and patrons whom you're seeing on screen that this channel can stay afloat. Without you, it would all shut down. If you want to join the team, there's a link to join the channel below this video, and there's a link to join the Patreon in the description. On the Patreon, you can get a 10% discount for pledging annually, and either way, you get early access to virtually all of my scripted videos, often 3 to 5 months before they come out for the general public. Thanks for watching.